attractive. Larry Summers, the former Secretary of the Treasury, president of Harvard, had a great comment. He said, when European and Americans go to Africa, the Africans get a lecture about climate change. When the Chinese go to Africa, they get a shiny new airport. So that's something that we have to...
Every time China gets called out for how it trades or operates in Africa, someone fires back with the same accusation: hypocrisy. The West preaches free markets, then slaps on tariffs the moment Beijing gets competitive. The West lectures on labor and the environment, then funds its own extraction deals overseas. Is that a fair hit or just noise? Today we're testing that charge against the sharpest defenses of Western policy we could find. On tariffs, on electric vehicles, on Africa, even on Venezuela. Some of it holds up, some of it doesn't. Stick around, because the answer isn't what either side wants it to be. Before we get into it, make sure you're subscribed and turn on notifications. Here we break down the biggest political and cultural stories from around the world, challenge the narratives dominating the headlines, and give you a perspective you won't get from the mainstream media. Let's get into it.
I think it's very hilarious when Western countries, politicians or economists, when they want something from development countries, they demand everyone follow the free world, free trade rules. But when companies from development countries such as China is outcompeting them, they start to demand. They also add a lot of bans and export controls. Let's not forget, just last year, at the beginning of last year, there are a lot of actually 2026 trade tariffs, unilateral tariffs adding on a lot of countries and adding on China. And because of the China's EVs are performing very well in Europe countries, recently I saw some articles on European media claiming it's a Chinese company's full-blown assault on their market. So when development countries play the capitalism game much better than their counterparts in Western countries, they start to add same bans. So I heard the other guest mentioned the China's ban. Well, don't forget, the U.S. had a lot of bans on AI, on chips, on trade, on China as well. Not just on China, on many countries. So
yeah,
I think.
I mean, look, there are national security concerns around certain things like chips, but also we're very conscious of China stealing IP from the Americans. So there's some legitimate reasons for tariffs.
What IP is stealing from Americans?
Li Jingjing lays out the hypocrisy charge in its clearest form. Western countries lecture the world about free trade, then reach for tariffs the moment a developing country actually wins. She points to something like 206 new tariffs added in a single year, and to the EU slapping tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles that European media supposedly called an assault on the industry. Here's where it gets interesting. That specific tariff count doesn't show up anywhere in the actual trade data. The World Trade Organization tracks these things closely, and its own numbers use different measures and different timeframes. Nobody can confirm where that 206 figure came from. The EV tariffs, though, are completely real. The EU investigated Chinese subsidies and landed on tariffs as high as 45%. But the word assault, that's not coming from European coverage. That language traces back to Chinese state media, not to the West. Strip away the shaky numbers, and you're still left with a real pattern. Tariffs on Chinese EVs, batteries, and solar cells did ramp up right as those industries became competitive. That timing is documented. Whether it's protectionism dressed up as security policy or legitimate policy that happens to coincide with competition is exactly the question this episode needs to test.
Yeah, 99% of counterfeit goods captured by the U.S. security services are from China. So we know that the Chinese steal. It's the old, the U.S. innovates, the Europeans.
But how come those companies that China stole?
Greg Swenson's answer is direct. China steals intellectual property, and the proof, he says, is that 99% of counterfeit goods seized by US authorities come from China. That number doesn't hold up. Customs and Border Protection's own data puts China and Hong Kong combined at around 80%. not 99, and that's combining two sources, not China alone. Older international data from the OECD lands even lower, at just over 75%. So, the specific stat is wrong. But don't let that sink the underlying point entirely. China is still, by a wide margin, the single largest source of counterfeit goods reaching American shores. That's confirmed by both US and European customs data. The problem is that Swenson reached for a number that sounds more damning than what's actually documented, and that undercuts the argument's credibility right when it needs to carry weight. This is the pattern worth watching for on both sides of this debate. A real underlying issue gets stapled to an exaggerated statistic, and the exaggeration becomes the thing people remember. If the goal is proving tariffs are principled and not selective, you don't get there by inflating the evidence. You get there with the real 80%, which is bad enough on its own.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, if the Chinese didn't have the capability of shutting down electric vehicles, then we would be happy to buy them in the U.S. But because there's a national security risk there, and the Chinese are known for basically planting their own private technology on electric vehicles, they'd have the ability to shut down electric vehicles with the flip of a switch. So, look, I know that sounds a little paranoid, but the truth is the CCP is running a mercantilist economy. So we have to be very careful of what we.
Now here's the strongest version of the security argument, and it turns out to be exactly as advertised. Swenson raises the fear that Chinese-made electric vehicles could be remotely disabled, and he frames it as the reason for the US restriction. Check the record, and this isn't hype. The Commerce Department finalized a rule in January of 2025 banning Chinese and Russian-linked connected vehicle technology, citing the risk of foreign manipulation. And Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo herself described the nightmare scenario in almost identical terms, warning about millions of cars on the road with software an adversary could shut off. That's not a talking point dressed up as fact. That's an actual government official on the record making that exact case. This is the justification the hypocrisy charge has to reckon with. You can debate whether the risk is proportionate to the response, or whether a phase-in stretching out to 2030 means it's not quite the emergency it's framed as. But you can't say the security rationale was invented for this argument. It's real, it's documented, and it's a genuinely different category of concern from ordinary trade competition.
Yeah, first of all, let me, because the other guest mentioned the US as a free market doing free trade. Well, it's funny that the Chinese EV companies cannot have factories in the US. They are banned from entering the US market. Well, if you look at China, Tesla has their biggest factory in Shanghai. Apple has their biggest factories in Shanghai. If you go to some shopping centers in Beijing, in Shanghai, you will see all American businesses having their largest stores. The American businesses, some of them were dying in the US, but they are blooming in China's market. So to me, I think China's market is much more open.
So if the security argument is real, what do we make of Li's comeback? She says China's market is actually more open to the West than the US is to China. Tesla's biggest factory is in Shanghai. Apple's production has been centered there for years. Meanwhile, Chinese EV makers can't build a thing in America. The specific facts check out. Gigafactory Shanghai really did become Tesla's largest and most important plant. Apple's manufacturing base really has been centered in China for most of its history, though Apple doesn't own those factories directly and production has been shifting to India and Vietnam. And yes, Chinese EV companies are effectively locked out of the US market through tariffs and the connected vehicle rule we just covered. But notice what this argument leaves out. China's own market comes with joint venture requirements, data localization rules, and sector limits that make life plenty hard for foreign firms too. Nobody's built a clean, comprehensive scorecard comparing the two systems side by side. So, this is a real asymmetry in these two specific examples. It's not proof that China runs the freer market overall. The honest read is that both systems restrict foreign access where it suits them. And the US restriction on Chinese EVs has a distinct security rationale that a general comparison of market openness doesn't erase.
Africa, and I've done a lot of business in Africa. It's heartbreaking what they do. They go in and exploit the resources. They cut down, for example, in timber, which I'm very active in. They cut down the trees.
People accuse the United States of doing a similar thing in Venezuela, though, Greg.
You know what? With Venezuela is unique, but the Venezuelan people are benefiting from those political changes, let's call it, in Venezuela. But when you see the Western Europeans and the Americans, when you see the way we operate in Africa, again, for example, I just pick on Africa because that's where I've been spending a lot of my time. They do it in a very beneficial way for the people of those countries. They're very strict about it. The Norwegians, for example, with their big sovereign wealth fund, Norfund, and the Americans with USDFC, they have really strict guidance on labor standards, on replacing resources. If we mine, we replace, we dig a hole, but we fill it back in. Whereas the Chinese have come in and cutting down trees, not replacing the trees, digging mines, exploiting the minerals, bringing in their own prison labor and cheap labor. So we're very suspicious, as you can see from my comments, we're very suspicious about how the Chinese are operating in the developing world, but we surely don't want to expose our own country to that as well.
The episode shifts now from trade to something closer to home in a lot of these debates: how China operates in Africa. Swenson draws on his own time in the timber business there, describing deforestation without replanting, mining without cleanup, and cheap or coerced labor. And he contrasts that with groups like Norway's Norfund and America's own development finance arm, which operate under strict standards. Independent reporting backs up a real problem here. Investigations in the Congo's Ituri region, in Zimbabwe's mining sector, and in Mozambique's timber trade all document serious environmental damage and labor violations tied to Chinese operations, including one finding that 93% of Mozambican logging headed to China was illegal. And Norfund and the US Development Finance Corporation really do operate under formal environmental and social standards, benchmarked against international frameworks. What doesn't hold up as cleanly is the prison labor claim specifically. That's Swenson's own business experience talking, and it isn't independently confirmed by anything here. It's also worth being honest that comparing two carefully regulated Western development institutions with Chinese extraction broadly isn't a perfectly even comparison. The documented harm is real. The full picture is a little less tidy than the contrast makes it sound.
Is the United States of doing a similar thing in Venezuela, though, Greg?
You know what? With Venezuela is unique, but the Venezuelan people are benefiting from those political changes, let's call it, in Venezuela. But when you see the Western Europeans and the Americans, when you see the way we operate in Africa.
Somebody in the room raises Venezuela, and Swenson's answer is that US involvement there is different because Venezuelans are actually benefiting. This is the moment where the double standard question gets tested most directly, and it's worth being honest about what the evidence actually shows. Some of it is genuinely good news. Over 600 political prisoners were released in the weeks after the change in government. But the IMF, looking at the country in February of 2026, called the economic and humanitarian situation quite fragile, still pointing to triple-digit inflation, deep poverty, and crushing public debt. Hundreds of political prisoners remained locked up at the very same time those releases were happening. And the international reaction split sharply, with much of Latin America, Africa, and Asia condemning the intervention while Western governments backed it. So the claim that Venezuelans have clearly benefited doesn't hold up yet. That's not a verdict on the intervention itself. It's simply that the evidence at this point doesn't support calling it a settled success. If the standard for judging foreign involvement is actual outcomes for ordinary people, this argument needs to be held to that same standard used to criticize China. Right now, it can't claim the clean vindication it's reaching for.
and free for Western companies. And second, about Africa, I happened to meet and interviewed a lot of African scholars, not just Africans, people from all across developing countries, either in West Asia, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, and Africa. You know, all the African scholars that I talked to gave me the opposite answers. I asked them why they want to work with Chinese companies. For one reason, they said, you know what? China is involved in every sector in, for example, Nigeria. But there's only one area China is not involved, is the politics. And people from other countries, Rwanda, Tanzania, they are the same. Like, because when we work with China, there's no political strings attached, only business. And Africans can say no to this deal. If they don't like it, they can say no. And the Chinese companies will bring a new deal and see how they like it. And it's completely business. They don't come here to give them lessons. If they don't like the deal, they turn down the deal. There are no color revolutions. There are no CIA assassinations. So that, and I know a lot of Western experts and media claim the so-called debt trap diplomacy on Africa. But when I ask African scholars, African people who work in those factories, they say, you know, come on, we've been through colonizations for hundreds of years. We know what colonization is. And the relationship work with China is not colonization. So when Western experts claim they are being oppressed, they feel like, don't you want to hear what African people say? They know exactly what it is. So I think, well, if don't believe it, you can go to my channel, watch my interviews.
Lee closes this thread with something harder to wave away. Actual interviews with African and other developing world scholars who say they'd rather deal with China precisely because the arrangements are pure business. No political conditions, no threats attached, no talk of the kind of foreign-backed political upheaval that sometimes follows Western involvement. That's testimony, not a data set, and it rests on an assumption worth naming: that the people interviewed represent broader sentiment in their countries rather than just a slice of it. But it's not nothing either. It lines up with something real underneath this whole episode. A deal with no conditions attached is exactly the kind of deal that also comes with no accountability attached, which fits with the documented environmental and labor problems already on the table. So, both things can be true at once. Some people in these countries genuinely prefer working with Beijing because Washington's deals come loaded with political demands. And the reason Beijing's deals feel simpler is also the reason there's less standing between a Chinese mining operation and the kind of damage already documented here. That's not hypocrisy exposed. That's a trade-off nobody's pretending is free. So, where does this land? Start with tariffs. The exact numbers people threw around, the 206 count, the 99% counterfeit stat, don't survive contact with the actual data. But strip the bad math away and the real pattern survives. Tariffs on Chinese EVs, batteries and solar did ramp up right as those industries got competitive. And China genuinely is the largest source of counterfeit goods reaching American shores. That's not nothing. Then you get to the strongest piece of evidence in the entire episode: the security case against Chinese-made EVs. That's not a talking point. That's a finalized Commerce Department rule and a Commerce Secretary on the record describing millions of cars an adversary could shut off remotely. You can argue about proportion. You cannot argue that it was invented for this fight. Lee's comeback, that China's market is actually more open than ours, checks out on the specific facts, including Tesla's Shanghai plant and Apple's manufacturing history. But it leaves out China's own joint venture rules and data localization walls. And it doesn't touch the security rationale at all. Real asymmetry, not proof of a double standard. Africa is where the documented harm is hardest to argue away. Deforestation, illegal logging, labor abuse, all independently confirmed. The prison labor claim doesn't hold up on its own, and comparing regulated Western development institutions with Chinese extraction broadly isn't perfectly clean. But the underlying damage is real. And here's the one place the conservative defense actually breaks: Venezuela. The claim that ordinary Venezuelans are already benefiting from the change in government doesn't match the IMF's own assessment from earlier this year. Still triple-digit inflation, still deep poverty, with hundreds of political prisoners still locked up while others walked free. If the standard is real-world outcomes, that argument doesn't meet its own bar yet. Then there's the testimony from scholars who say they'd rather deal with Beijing precisely because there's no political string attached. That's real, and it's not something you can wave off. But no conditions also means no accountability, and that's exactly why the damage in Africa keeps happening. Put it all together, and the honest verdict is this: the hypocrisy charge doesn't hold up as a blanket claim. The EV security rationale is genuine, and it's a different category from ordinary trade protectionism. But the West doesn't get a clean pass either. The Venezuela defense collapses under its own standard, and the African development comparison is far less tidy than a straight better versus worse pitch. This isn't a story where one side wins. It's a story where the honest answer costs something to admit, and that's exactly why it's worth admitting it. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe.